Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Science of Spirit. And today's topic is going to be on health and the energy in your body. A combination of how the mind and emotions and actual energy in the body kind of work together. So now, some of this is my own ideas on this, but a lot of it is also proven by other scientists. So I'd say it's pretty common knowledge now that the mind, the emotions, and stress all affect your body. They all affect what's going on with it. They basically are what create disease. Now, let me also state before I get going any further here that I am not a healthcare practitioner. So these are just my ideas, so take it for what you will. So to start off, I want to talk a little bit about a man named Dr. Wilhelm Reich, who was a scientist back in the early part of this century. I think he died back in like 1954. And Reich realized that there was a relationship between a person's thoughts and emotions and actual diseases or afflictions in the body. He was a psychiatrist. I don't know whether he used hypnosis at all. I think he was mostly, with the talk therapy, but I think he also did some manipulations. And he came to that conclusion, and he realized that if he alleviated the mental issue, oftentimes the physical issue would go away or at least be alleviated. So somewhere along the line, he made the jump into that realization and that there was some type of an energy. He wanted to know what this energy was that was in the body. And I'm not going to go into detail with his work. If you're interested, definitely look into, there's many books that he's written. All pretty fascinating. Some of it more of a psychiatric type thing, more of it on the energy aspect. So he was actually doing experiments, trying to find out what this energy did, what was it, where did it come from? And he realized it was in the atmosphere, and he could kind of accumulate it. And so he made these things called Orgone accumulators, because he referred to the energy as actually orgone. Now, we might refer to it as ether, maybe etheric energy, astral energy. I'm not sure if those are completely the same thing, but you see where I'm going with that. So he called it orgone, and he made these orgone accumulators, which were basically large capacitors that were big enough that you could sit in. And he noticed a big difference in what would happen with his patients. Now, he still knew that the mental or emotional aspect would, cause a disease, but he also noticed that there was a lot of alleviation if people sat in these accumulators. And he experimented with cancer patients and so forth, and a lot of the cancer patients, it seemed to prolong their life, but they died anyway because, once again, you had to get to the root of the problem. But in all of this, there were some patients who had arthritis, and they just happened to have arthritis, and they had something else that he actually had them sit in the accumulator for. But he noticed it alleviated the arthritis. So there are a bunch of people who wanted these things just because it alleviated arthritis, but they had to sit in it all the time. So it really depends on what the root cause of something is. If it's emotional, you have to get to it. Sitting in an accumulator might help. And other modalities might definitely help. I mean, there's things you can do nutritionally that will definitely help with the inflammation if you haven't quite gotten to the root, or you know that there's a stress out there, but you just can't get it taken care of right now. So there are things you can do to kind of tide yourself over, so to speak. But still, you have to get to the root cause, no matter what it is. And a lot of things can be alleviated nutritionally. But once again, there's still something causing it initially. If you look at things like, inflammation, fibromyalgia, some of that stuff, that you can help that out a lot if you change your diet. I mean, I've definitely done that myself, and it definitely helps. But until the stress is relieved, you're probably still going to have some of that. So if you start eating some of that thing that's causing extra inflammation, it's going to be right back again. So from my perspective, it's really about cutting off energy to certain parts of the body, pretty much with almost any disease. And I think cancer would probably be a big one to look into with this. And whether it's a mental stress that's actually cutting off the energy to certain organs and areas, and then the cells don't get what they need energetically. I mean, we're just talking about life force energy. Then it starts to die. Now, I'm sure people can argue with me about this, but it would still seem to be accurate on a lot of different levels. And Reich kind of came to that conclusion when it came to cancer, because he did have a lot of basically terminally ill people that he put into an accumulator, and saw a definite reduction in the tumors. But what would happen, and now we're kind of understanding this a little bit more, but I don't think he did back then, is that he would say that they would go through this kind of a emotional crisis if they sat in the accumulator long enough, and then they'd have an aversion to sitting in there. But now we know if you get immersed in a higher vibration or stronger energy field, I'm not exactly sure what it would have to be, but it will start bringing up emotional stuff. So that's what he was noticing with people sitting in a heavy-duty accumulator. Now, an accumulator is a capacitor, so it's basically something that is lined with metal and an insulator in layers. So a lightweight capacitor would be just a couple layers. A heavier one, or a stronger one, I should say, would be several layers. And there's other scientists who have done various experiments on things too and have noticed this relationship. And I totally believe that there's definitely a relationship between the energy and the energy flows in the body and how you are processing things emotionally. You know, do you let things stress you out easily, or do you let it pretty much flow off your back? Another thing is acupuncture, which is using metal needles to bring in or siphon off energy to areas of the body. That's basically what they're doing. They're manipulating the energy flow. And also, different types of metal make a difference. With the acupuncturists, I believe they used to use silver needles. And Reich used to build his capacitors or orgone accumulators with iron and then an insulator, but he noticed a difference in the strength of the energy depending on the type of insulator or the type of metal that he used. So anyway, getting back to health and nutrition, I do want to recommend Dr. Eric Berg's YouTube channel. You can use it kind of like a database of ailments, and he's got YouTube videos for all kinds of afflictions. I mean, anything. They're really short little videos, but he explains how your body works and what happens nutritionally. Now, he's very much a proponent of the ketogenic diet, and whether or not you would choose to do that is up to you, but I do think that his site is quite the resource for any kind of ailment and explanations as to how the body works. I was having some years ago quite a bit of inflammation. Not so much where you would see swelling, but my joints would ache. And I was pretty much diagnosed with everything from we have no idea what it is to, oh, it's arthritis, to fibromyalgia, you know, around and around and around we go. So I finally found Dr. Berg's site and I started looking into all of the things that he recommended. I did go ketogenic, but I also learned why I was getting the sore joints. Now, here's the thing. I knew fully well that stress and other issues were causing problems. So I knew that there was a core thing that needed to be fixed. But meanwhile, while I was working on that, this really alleviated the problem. Because it was to the point where I really couldn't even exercise very well without my joints being sore. So I did go on the ketogenic diet, and I did do a lot of the recommendations he had on there for, you know, sore joints and that sort of thing. And it totally alleviated it. But it's interesting. If I go off the diet for any length of time, it starts to come back right away. So I know I have not completely alleviated that stress, and I know exactly what it is, and I'm taking strides to get that fixed once and for all. But until then, it's something you can do to at least not be, you know, debilitated because of something. But he talks about everything else too, like, you know, diabetes, heart conditions, everything, and it's pretty interesting. So If you are having some health issues, that's at least a good resource for you. But of course, I would highly recommend going to a good therapist or hypnotherapist, or even sometimes, a regressionist, to get to the core issues and get them fixed. So getting now back to the energy topic, and yes, I do seem to be jumping all around here. Exercise. There's probably a happy medium or a sweet spot when it comes to exercising. I think we've all seen, people like marathon runners and these long distance runners who some of them are just so very skinny and almost emaciated looking. But they expend a lot of energy for quite a bit of time. Marathons can go on for quite a while. Not everyone seems to exhibit that, but some of them do. And then the opposite can occur when people just don't get enough exercise and there's not enough energy movement throughout the body. So you get this kind of a stagnation type thing going on, in my opinion. And so with stagnation, that was another thing that Wilhelm Reich noticed. He noticed that things would happen to this orgone energy if it was subjected to radiation, radioactivity. It would kind of stagnate it, and he called it deadly orgone energy. And it would actually disintegrate things. His lab was up in Maine at one point, and he had a home there, and I guess it had a granite fireplace. And he had done some experiments that had actually created this deadly orgone energy throughout his whole piece of property, which was several acres. I mean, the museum is actually still there up in Maine, the Wilhelm Reich Museum. But anyway, he said that the granite fireplace was starting to disintegrate. And a lot of his workers, and including himself to a certain extent, started to feel sick. They didn't really feel all that well. And they actually evacuated the property, which eventually this DOR went away, the deadly orgone energy. And they moved back. So it's kind of interesting to see that, stagnated energy can cause things to die and fall apart. And life energy, or what Reich referred to as orgone energy, had just the opposite. It would build up. That's what would create cells and create life and keep disintegration from happening. Now, Reich also did some experiments with cells and energy, and he noticed that if he took a substance such as coal and he heated it to incandescence or put it in an autoclave that would actually kill anything, any bacteria or anything in there, that when he looked at it underneath the microscope, he would start to see movement. And he referred to this as bions, these little cellular structures, which I've actually seen this in the lab. It's pretty fascinating. And you can watch them and they spin around and do all these things. And then out of the blue, you'll start to see one-celled animals show up. And you're like, well, let's see, we just sterilized everything and we've still got life forming. So we were assuming that from those bions, or these little structures that spin and move and pulsate, that's where some of these one-celled animals were coming from. I'm not definitive on that, but it would appear to be the case. And that's what he saw and has been reproduced in the lab since his time. But you really don't hear about this because it goes against the narrative, of what's being taught to everyone. So they just kind of ignore it or suppress it. It's really kind of a shame. So, and we know that, if you go into biology, they say that life is a struggle against entropy. Well, maybe it is, but maybe it really isn't if you know what to do about it. So I will leave you with something that actually Bashar, my favorite channeler Bashar by Daryl Anka. If you haven't listened to some of my recordings that I've done of transcripts of his, I really urge you to listen to it because it's pretty interesting information. But he said something very briefly on a transmission. And this was in regards to aging. And he said that, and this is the first time I'd heard this, so it's kind of keeping along with my theory, so I was kind of happy to hear this, that aging is not letting the full energy support your body. It is a cutting off of the energy source by not acting on your full passion. And he said that those who do, act on their excitement and act on their passion as best as possible, thus having very little stress, that you can actually build the body back up again. He said that you can actually heal the body in that way without really doing much of anything else. It's that stress and that resistance that caused the problem. So I thought that was really interesting, that there isn't enough vital energy in the body to support it, so it falls apart. And Bashar is always talking about following your excitement, as much as you possibly can, and taking it as far as you can, and then when you can't take it any further, then move on to something else. But also always putting a positive spin on everything that happens, even unwanted things. There's always going to be a challenge. Life is going to be full of challenges. And so it's how you view those challenges that make the difference. If a person started out in life with always learning to look at the positive side of everything, and there may be times that it's more difficult to see the positive benefit of an occurrence. It may be for somebody else's benefit. But if you always have that attitude, then it's going to attract to you more of that, and you're going to have this positive synchronicity that just builds up. So if you could do that all your life, you'd pretty much never have to go to a regression therapist. Because that's what, regression therapy is about. It's about going back to the past, looking at something that was taken in a not so stellar way, something that made you upset, and it's turning it around and putting a more positive spin on it. That's pretty much what it is in a nutshell. Now, it can get a little bit complicated, or it can be more like an onion where you fix one thing and you find out there's more layers to it. But that's the general premise. And I think those who go, to a psychiatrist and that sort of thing, they're trying to get it from a different view, talk it out and put a more positive spin on it, I would assume. But when you're in hypnosis, it's easier to get to that subconscious mind where all of these beliefs are lodged and, do something about it. So that's just my personal view on that. So I hope this explained a little bit about how energy works in the body and how health is dependent on that, but also how different modalities, other different things, like what you're eating and exercising and all that, also how that all plays a part, along with your stress level and what you're thinking. That's actually the basis of the whole thing. If you can fix that, I think you're pretty good to go. Now, grant that you might be ingesting some types of toxins and things like that in the food, so it would always be a good idea to not have that. And also to make sure that you're digesting your food properly, that you're getting enough nutrients, and of course, getting enough exercise. I hope that explains a little bit then about how all of this comes together for optimal health. And if you are interested in the works of Wilhelm Reich, he wrote many different books. One in particular that's pretty interesting is The Cancer Biopathy. It gives an explanation of what he found to be the relationship between the energetic component and cancer growth. So that might be something you want to check out if you're inclined to. So this is Janice with The Science of Spirit, and if you're listening to YouTube, please subscribe to my channel and click the bell to be notified when I upload again. And be sure to share this with your friends. I am also on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, and Spotify. Thank you so much for listening.